So, Robert, did you put that clock up there to tell me how long I have? It needs a countdown. No, I truly doubt I'll take all the time. Well, good evening. When Scott called me on Monday, or sent a note out on Monday saying that he wouldn't be here, he gave some opportunity to do whatever I wanted tonight, so good luck. Actually, Scott and Kim are doing a really cool thing tonight. They have traveled to Mulgi, where Macy and Avery have been worshiping for the last year, and they're thanking the congregation and the elders for what they've been able to do for their kids for basically the last year. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing. So he asked that we cover tonight and gave me the opportunity to do whatever I wanted. I know we just finished last week at the Ascension of Jesus, and next week he's going to be talking about the various churches of Revelation. Church of Sardis, I think, is where he's going to start, which I think is cool because that's the church that needed to wake up, which was a theme of a sermon that I got to do recently. So when he said that, I tried to figure out how can I do something that will help apply the study that he's currently doing, and then also maybe have a secondary purpose in that this light of the world theme that we're in, and especially in consideration of how the world around us is changing. And it reminded me, Lori just came back from Tennessee this past weekend, and she doesn't like driving long distances, so she turned on the radio and she was listening to anything that she could find interesting. And she said she heard this story or this conversation about lenses and the way we view things through various lenses. And she found this to be such a cool discussion, and she shared it with me. And you know, when you Google it, when you Google lenses and viewing different things through your perspective and various perspectives, you're going to see a lot of different worldviews, and basically a lot of how to be happy, how to make sure that you change and project your lens in such a way that you can view things with a different idea than what you may have if you didn't see it in this way that's going to provide a different emotion, if you will. But when I think of these lenses, I also have to think about a recent conversation that I heard about between two academic students, and they were, I believe, discussing social justice or injustice. And I'm confident that they were having a conversation where one was an atheist and one was a Christian. And the Christian made this comment. She said, you know, I just can't see it that way because I believe in a God. I believe in a Bible. I believe in the Word of God, and it just will not allow me to see it the way you're seeing it. And I thought, in combination with what Lori was telling me and what I was hearing in that conversation, and in consideration with the fact that we live in a world that's changing, we could go amongst our community for the last 30 years and talk about Christ, and you're going to be talking to somebody 90% of the time that was going to be a believer in Christ. They were going to believe that Jesus was the Son of God, that we have an inerrant Bible, and it is the Word of God. But the world around us is changing, and that may not be the case. And as we go through this time where we're going to be light to the world, we have to recognize the various lenses that people may be seeing what we have to offer. It's a sad situation because not only are we losing a God faith, we're losing some within our community. We're also losing some within our own church family, within our own personal families. And it's based on an idea that we have a Bible specifically that has problems. We have experts in this world, Bible experts, which I will tell you are typically agnostic or atheist when which makes it a very interesting dilemma there, in my opinion. But these atheists, these agnostics, even some Christian academics are placing our children, our community, in a situation where they point out issues with the Bible, and they have these PhDs, they have all these letters behind their name, and what kind of world do we live in right now? We live in a world where the expert rules. And if an expert tells you something, you believe it. And we have kids that are going off to college. And I read a really good book recently called Surviving Religion 101, written by Michael Kruger. And one of the chapters is entitled, "My Professors Are Really Smart. Isn't it more likely they're right and I'm wrong?" That's the world we live in. It's not just our students, it's a lot of people. And when they're presented with things about the Old Testament that doesn't fit social justice, when they're being presented ideas about things that aren't exactly the same within the New Testament, maybe the gospel, the synoptic gospels that may have slight variations, when they're presented with things that they weren't ready for, their faith is being deconstructed. And a vacuum is being left, and it's being filled by a community of agnostics and atheists. So as we approach this next week, talking about the churches specifically that Scott's going to be talking about, when we start thinking about the world we live in and the lenses that people may be viewing what we have to offer, we have to realize that, number one, if we're talking to somebody that's not wanting to believe the Bible, how do you address them? I've told this story, and I know many of you have been in the class before. So when I was a junior in college, I had a friend who was taking a philosophy class. And we had a theological conversation one day on the political campaign trail, no less. And he asked me why I was a Christian. And I said, well, because the Bible tells me this. And he said, well, why do you believe the Bible? And what's my answer? I went to this congregation as a child. We had Bible hour right across the hallway. And when they asked if it's in the Bible, what were we told to say? Reese, do you remember that? It's absolutely true. Thank you. And not only did we say it, we had to shout it. And we knew that it was true. Why? Because we were told it was true. Now, I told this friend of mine that answer. Now, how do you think it impacted him? Not the same. It was different. This is what he did. He said, okay, and he took a piece of paper, and he wrote on it, and he handed it to me, and I read it. And it said, "You're an idiot." And he said, "You know why? You can believe that because it says so right after that. You can believe this because I said it." So how do we approach the atheist? How do we approach those that have been convinced by these academics? How do we approach the scholars of our world that we have a light that they need to receive? How do we teach them about our Christ? Now, having given this a little thought, I wanted to take the time tonight to talk about the various things that will help us know that basically early Christian background, help us with the ideas that have occurred, help us maybe spark some conversation, spark some additional study this week that will have the dual effect of being prepared for next week when he starts talking about church and the culture and the things that they were going through and experiencing, and possibly seeing things that will help you have conversations and not be shocked when somebody makes a statement about the Bible that you'd never heard before. So we're going to talk a little bit about early Christian background, and we're going to start with some things that we've mentioned in the class before, but there's some additional writings that as a child I was told we could ignore completely because they don't really matter to us anymore. Now, I want you guys to know, if you have any interest in this topic of early church history, Everett Ferguson, an Abilene Christian or a former Abilene Christian professor, has written many volumes on this topic, and they're all fantastic. Some of them are in textbook form, and then he has some. He has a PhD from Harvard on this topic, and he's a fantastic source. This book specifically is a really good source, and the review of this book, it gives a good reason why we study the early church history. But there are some early writings that help us understand the socio-cultural environment, maybe some liturgical history, some things that help you get the context of what was going on pre-New Testament, during New Testament, and then into the second century. The Apocrypha is a word that means hidden or secret. It was initially thought of as something that was too secret for the common knowledge of people. However, over time, it takes on a different view of things, and we see it's very doubtful in its canonicity, so it was never placed in canon. It's not canon, but it does provide some things that can help you understand what people thought of and what they thought of themselves during this time period. The Apocrypha is mainly the pre-New Testament extra writings. Many of them were actually in the Septuagint, so the Greek translation, they were included. It's included in Catholic Bibles, but for the most part, they're not canon. But there are folks that still believe they are canon, and they would call them deuterocanon, and we would call it Apocrypha. But it does have value, and I would encourage people to at least have some knowledge about it. Pseudepigrapha. This is more of the time period of during the New Testament church, at first century. These writings are very relevant right now. There's a lot of people talking about these in our academic settings, and you'll get, if you go on the internet and read just Google Gospel of Thomas, there's scholars, there's people wanting to talk about the Gospel of Thomas because they want to say that's the hidden part that the church doesn't want you to know. And there's people that believe that. Now, the Gospel of Thomas is about 114 different sayings of Jesus. It's not written by Thomas, unless he somehow lived into the 200s. And it's more of a Gnostic writing, so it's got some dualism in it, thinking that the body is less important than the spirit. It also has a lot of anti-woman rhetoric in it. There's a lot of things that actually do tie in with some of the gospel sayings of Jesus, but on the other hand, there's a lot of things that there's some very interesting things that get said in this Gospel of Thomas, but it is a very relevant thing right now, and to have information about it would be important. Now, pseudepigrapha is a word that means it's attributed to somebody that didn't write it. And from a biblical standpoint, they're Jewish books that were attributed to patriarchs, and they didn't write them. But they are providing some, it provides some looking at the hermeneutical, the way that things were being read, and the way things were being interpreted from a contextual standpoint. There's writings of the apostolic fathers. Now, this is an interesting one because these are the earliest writings after that first century period, and they were attributed to the servants, the deacons, the disciples of the apostles. Now, that's a false assumption of nearly, if not all of them, but the idea is that these writings were supposed to have come the closest to beyond the apostles, but from the apostles. Now, again, from a socio-cultural standpoint, very interesting, can provide some insight as to what's going through the minds of the people during this time that you're going to be reading about these churches. As part of the apostolic fathers, there's the Didache, which is, it literally is called the teaching. It's supposed to be the teaching of the 12 apostles. It's not, but it contains instructions for Christians that were thought to be canon at one time and followed. There's 4 basic parts. There's the first part that's the 2 ways, the way of life, the way of death. So it has an eschatological function. The second part is the rituals. That's going to discuss how baptism is supposed to be performed, which is interesting because the Didache says that the baptism must be done in running water, if possible. Needs to be warm, but if it can't be warm, it can be cool. If you can't find that, you can sprinkle 3 times, as long as certain words are said, and it absolutely requires in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So the Didache is an interesting read that is something that provides a lot of insight into these churches as they go forward into this time period where you're going to read a lot about Gnosticism. Then there's historians, and I hope some of these things, I hope you might want to take a look at some of the early mentioning of Christ and Christianity in history. It's so interesting to read. We've got Latin historians, Greek historians. We've got the Jewish historian Josephus, but the Roman historian Suetonius, he's going to mention Christians in 3 of his works: the Lives of 12 Caesars. He actually is going to refer to Jesus in that work. There's a passage in the biography of the Emperor of Claudius where he's going to discuss the agitations of the Jews, and it's during a time period, AD 41 to 54, that many people do believe is a reference to Acts 18 verse 2. So in Acts 18 verse 2, this is, if you recall, this is when we have Priscilla and Aquila. They've left Rome, and Paul has come across them. And in verse 2, they've left Rome because Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And this is the basic scenario that you're reading in this work of history. It's the same situation. We also read the word Christo, which is mentioned, is intended to mean Christ in another one of his works. He discusses the situation with Nero, and if you've not ever read the history of what went on with Nero and the persecution of Christians, it's a very fascinating story of history, because Nero was thought of to have started the Roman fire. The people thought he started it, so he has to find a scapegoat. So he blames the Christians, and in doing so, according to Suetonius' biography of Nero, he's going to punish the Christians, and this is going to be something that's going to be excessive, and I'm going to go into that in a little more detail in just a second. But basically, he is going to blame anybody with the label Christian, and he's going to punish them in horrible, horrible ways. Now, one very interesting point from this historian is Christians were thought of as being something known as the superstitio, which is the root word for superstition. But as we're going to see, that's going to play important in the way the Romans viewed Christians in just a moment. There's one other historian I just wanted to mention, and that's the one that really goes into the Great Fire. And he basically says that Nero, in his effort to point the blame to the Christians, found someone. He found a Christian. He found a Christian to accept and confess. And by that confession in name, all Christians were to blame. And Tacitus writes that consequently, to get rid of this idea that he was the one that did it, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition. Thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, the immense multitude was convicted, not so much of a crime of firing the city as the hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or nailed to crosses, or were doomed to flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. There were Greek authors that have references to Christ. Lucian, he's going to satirize Christians. He's going to show in his work, The Passing of the Peregrinus, a story about a philosopher. Now, understand, he's a philosopher who at one point becomes a leader of the Christians so that he could take advantage of their gullibility. Cellus also writes in his The True Word, he's going to be the first person to actually take on a critical assessment of Christianity, and that's in the 2nd century, post Justin the Martyr. But I find it interesting, and I hope you do too, and I've been told I use the word interesting too much, so somebody wave at me if I say it again, okay? My wife just blushed, I'm sure. So this is how they were viewed. This is the people that are sharing the light at this time period. And I want you guys to consider that. This is what they're being thought of, yet the Christ is being spread throughout this world. And it's growing to the point of, it's growing. Yet they think of them as gullible. They think of them as superstitio. They think of them as all these things that are repugnant to their world. We also have the Jewish source, Josephus. Josephus is the Jewish historian that was basically tasked by the Romans to give the Jewish history. And he wrote a couple of great works, The Jewish War and the Antiquities of Jews. Now, I do have to say this, that historians during this time period is different than the historians we look at. See, we have our lens. We have our Western world lens. And when we think of history, we think of accuracy, and we think of chronological order. We think of all these things. But from a first century historian's point of view, you write what the history should have been, just as much as what it was. So you have to read these historians and Josephus with a little latitude as you read them. But Josephus offers a lot of testimony of Jesus and of the canons. Talking about the Hebrew Bible, talks about a lot of various things that can give you some great insight as to what was going on at this time. Now, there's a lot of archaeological things that are important. You can see the Delphi inscription of Galileo. This inscription is going to be a collection of 9 fragments that's written by the Roman Emperor Claudius. Now, these fragments are being found in Delphi, which is where the temple of Apollo was in Greece. It's a very important temple, very important place. It's maybe the most important of all the oracles of that time period. And on this inscription, he's going to be talking about this first century when there's such a sad time because there's no more citizens living in the city. Now, Claudius writes of receiving advice from a subject from the proconsul Gallio, the Roman senator who dismissed the charges against Paul in Acts 12 through 17. So in Acts 12 through 17, but when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God, contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. So there's a lot of outside the sources, that outside the book, that you can read about that ties this history of what went on to our biblical record. And you have to understand, there's a lot of people in this world, especially in the academic world, that believes Acts specifically has no historicity to it at all. They believe that this is completely a theological writing of Luke, that he wrote it for a purpose. Yes, he tied things that happened, but the point was it wasn't history. Yet we see in their historical records things that say that's just not true. And I think that's important, because when the scholars and academics are telling our kids these things about the historicity of our canon, they don't mention some of these things. So as we approach those among our community and within our own families, it's really good information to have looked at. Now, there's the papyri, the Christian papyri. This is the Papyrus 52. This is the oldest known bits of papyri, where this is actually from the Gospel book of John. It's the smallest fragment. It's only 9 centimeters high, and it contains the verses 31 through 33. And I believe there's another section that contains 37 and through 38 of chapter 23. This is in Greek. It was originally discovered in Egypt. Now, one of the really cool things about this discovery is it was found, and it can be dated to probably the 2nd century. Okay, so it's not that 1st century. It's just a little later than the 1st century. But we can read and see through this that this is in Egypt, North Egypt, and this is what they're reading. They're reading from the Gospel of John. And it's especially interesting knowing that this is from a codex, which it's a book, not a roll. And John is one of the, I believe it's considered the last of the writings. John and Revelation are the two latest books of the New Testament. So to understand that this religion, this movement, this Christ following has moved throughout that area into Egypt, and that they're studying these things as early as the 2nd century, has something to say about the spread of Christianity in that district, in that area. And it is absolutely a testament to the fact that the message is getting out there and being received even by folks that find the whole Christian Christ following repugnant. Now, there's one last thing in these this section, that we have all kinds of extensive points of contact in the New Testament, and that's coins. There's an extensive coinage in the early Roman Empire that provides all kinds of names, dates, and periods that allows us to see that there is historical background to our canon, our New Testament. There's some claimed archaeology remains. Before I do that, if you find manuscript stuff interesting, which I did, there's an organization, there's a Dr. Wallace, he's a seminary down in Dallas, they have a organization called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. What they do is they go around to the different collections, and they're able to scan them basically so that they can present them. And you can go online at that website and see the various fragments. And he also has a lot of learning material on there about the fragments and about the whole process that they go through. It's extremely fascinating. There's also some claimed archaeological finds that help with early Christianity. This is known as the Rotas Sator word square. And early Christians, they had they were very attuned to symbols. Symbols meant something to them. They were steeped in myth, mysteries, metaphors, omens, divinations, all these things, allegories, and symbols meant a lot. And in the archaeological finds, a lot of times they look for these kind of symbols to determine what the beliefs were of the people that they found. And this is especially interesting because this is a palindrome. If we take a look at this, you can see the 5-letter Latin words are read in a line or order horizontally and vertically, or backwards or forwards, and they're all the same. And they mean the sower holds or works the wheels with care. Basically, another translation is he who works the plow sows the seed. So this is a palindrome where the words read exactly the same frontwards and backwards. And right in the middle, you'll see tenant and a cross. Now, when all of this is rearranged in a cryptogram, you'll see that it's going to change the nature of it to basically start the Lord's Prayer. If you've seen the movie Tenet, which I haven't, but I read a lot about this. This is a major part of the movie's thesis. They have this cryptogram that has this important key to the reality. And when you take a look at this, you can read the same thing frontwards, backwards, vertically, horizontally, and it is a symbol that they found all over this region. Now, there is some conflict as to whether it's Christian or Jewish in nature, but it's still something that is alleged to be early Christianity. There's also the cross of the Herculaneum that they've found in Pompeii and in Herculaneum. This is pre the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. This is something that there is some conflict and debate as to whether that's intended to be a cross, but it is found in these structures that they've excavated above something that appears to be a wooden desk that would have been used very similarly to a place of worship in the pagan world. Lastly, in this little category is the ossuaries. The ossuaries were 2nd century. They are intended to, that's where you would put the body of the deceased. And there's thousands of these that have been discovered, and there's been numerous of them with different kinds of etchings, some words, and a few that have some biblical, some Christian words that are etched on them, including one that is known as the James ossuary, which has the Aramaic inscription, Jacob, James's son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, again, there's conflict, but it's one of those things that they have found that raises some question and some conversation and definitely some scholarly debate. Now, as you approach next week in your class, you're going to be reading about the Christians. You're going to be reading about them in their society, in their culture. And again, the attitude of the pagans towards the Christians is something that will come into play. Remember, they're spreading Christianity amongst people that we've already identified find them repugnant. Pagan comments and criticism of Christianity are very significant at this time. And in the Roman upper classes in the 2nd century, it's known as superstition. This is superstitio. If it's known as just the opposite of what religion was supposed to be considered. There's two basic phrases, superstitio and religio. Religio honors the gods, while superstitio is to dishonor them, according to the Roman writers. Tacitus does not believe that, if you remember, Tacitus is the Roman historian, and he didn't believe that the Christians were actually responsible for the fire, but he did, within his writings, call them a superstitio, something that dishonored God. Now, I showed a picture of Pliny the Little, or Pliny the Younger, and he was the Roman governor that also is going to write a letter to the Emperor Trajan, and he's also going to label the Christians as this superstition, and he's going to talk about these crimes of the Christians, and he describes to the emperor what he does when he comes across Christians. He says, "It is my custom, Lord Emperor, to refer to you all questions whether I am in doubt. Who can better guide me when I am at a stand, or enlighten me if I am in ignorance? In investigations of Christians I have never taken part, hence I do not know what is the crime usually punished or investigated, or what allowances are made. So I have had no little uncertainty whether there is any distinction of age, or whether the very weakest offenders are treated exactly like the stronger, whether pardon is given to those who repent, or whether a man who has once been a Christian gains nothing by having ceased to be such. So whether punishment attaches to the mere name apart from the secret crimes, or the secret crimes connected with the name. Meantime, this is the course I have taken with those who were accused before me as Christians. I asked them whether they were Christians, and if they confessed, I asked them a second and third time with threats of punishment. If they kept to it, I ordered them to be executed. For I held no question that whatever it was they admitted, in any case, obstinacy or an unbending perversity deserves to be punished. Therefore, there were others of the like insanity. But as these were Roman citizens, some of them would be sent down to Rome. So basically, he's talking about these secret crimes. And they're viewing the things that the Christians do as these secret crimes. And you'll read about them, and there's three basic things that the pagans viewed Christians as doing that were wrong. One was atheism. One was something called the Theestian feasts, and then the Oedipedian intercourse. Now, all three of these, when you understand what they are, you're going to think, how on earth did they come to these conclusions? First of all, the charge of atheism. How does a pagan call a Christian an atheist? Well, first of all, they're not worshiping the state gods. And if you're not worshiping the state gods, then that is completely the opposite of the paganism, the popular gods. So if they're not going to worship the state gods, they must be atheists. The Theestian banquets is known as cannibalism. And the Oedipedian intercourse is very repugnant in that it's talking about brother-sister, family incest. Now, how do they come to these things? Well, we mentioned the state gods, and if they're not going to worship the state gods, then they're obviously atheists, but the other two are basically just misunderstandings of the words that the Christians were using. Pagans had just enough of hearing about eating of the body and drinking the blood. And Christian talk about love and love feast and being brothers and sisters. These are terminology that in the Egyptian, brother and sister is husband and wife. So they got the wrong ideas, didn't they? But this is what they were dealing with. There was a popular ridicule of the Christians. This is the graffito from the guard room at the Palatine Hill near Circus Maximus in Rome. Now, this is a picture of a donkey on a cross. This is how they viewed the Christ, the Messiah. The figure of a man with the head of a donkey is shown hanging on a cross. Nearby, another man is raising his hands in worship and gesture of adoration. And the inscription reads, Alexmanus, which is the person, worships his God. So Jews had been charged with worshiping a donkey, and Jesus is that donkey. It conveys how contemptible. This is the lowest of lows. And this is how pagans thought of the Christ, of the worshiping of a crucified Lord. So we have the way they thought about it. What was the legal status of Christians? We studied this in Acts a lot. We saw that Jews and Christians were given and afforded a higher regard during this time by the Romans than what I personally had always thought as a younger person in the Hollywood sense of things. When you think of the Hollywood sense of the Romans and the Christians, what do you always think of? You think of the lion's dens. You think of all the persecutions. You think of Ben-Hur. You think of all those things. But the truth of the matter is, because the Jews had been an ally of Rome, they were afforded special privileges. Now, during this time period, there really was very little distinction being made between Jews and Christians. So they were also afforded the same legal status as the Jews. And this is going to change, and we start to see that change, and we see how the Jews are going to start making complaints about the Christians in Acts 18. There's an internal problem. There's these disorders that they're alleging. We see in chapters 13, 14, 19, 17, 18, 24, and 25, that's this turmoil that they're saying the Christians are causing, specifically Paul in many of these instances. There's stonings, there's all these things that are being presented involving life-threatening situations, and the pagan society is now going to start recognizing this turmoil between Christians and Jews, and basically they're going to be starting to get magistrates to consider that the legal status of the Christians should be treated differently. Now, we know, based on what we've already talked about, that Nero obviously treated them differently, because just the name alone, Christian, had people persecuted, burned, illuminated at night for the lights of the Romans. But these legal liabilities that are starting, and we read about in Acts specifically, it's going to take on this form where the Romans are going to start thinking suspiciously of the Christians. Now, just think about, they were already under a heavy specter already, because who are they worshiping? Their leader was somebody that had been crucified, the worst of the punishments. For what? For treason. The people that follow him are now causing turmoil, disorder. What was the one thing that the Roman government cared about more than anything? Keeping order. That was the crime. The disorder was the crime, not the religion. So this is how Jews started to successfully convince Roman authorities that Christians were this distinct group that needed to be punished, needed to be treated differently, and Christians would start to suffer just by bearing the name. And you can read in 1 Peter 4:16, there's an indication that the name is sufficient evidence for the punishment. There's a number of other hindrances. There's another other hindrances that during this time period, the social, economic, and cultural life, that they were polytheistic. This is monotheistic. These are things that were further repugnant situations for pagans. The idea of the divine births and deity fathering heroes through human mothers and things like that were all through paganism. But the idea of the divine, think of this: the pagans looked at the afterlife as something that was it was a goal to get to this afterlife, this place, and what the Christians were talking about was immortality, this incarnation, completely opposite of the situation that they were teaching. The doctrine of the bodily resurrection ran completely counter to the hopes about the afterlife that they were looking for. There's going to be religious rivals. We have Judaism that they have to deal with. They have the pagan religion and philosophy. We have Gnosticism that you're going to read about, second century Gnosticism. It's a kind of over-encompassing. It's like the boogeyman of theology. One of its main characteristics is dualism, considering the spirit over the body. And there's all kinds of things that you will see, and there's movements, the Marcionism, they reject the Old Testament completely. They rewrite Luke. They edit 10 letters of Paul. There's a number of these things. And Ferguson writes, variant forms of Christianity resulted not only from the mixture of Gentile religion and philosophy with the gospel, but also from efforts to domesticate it within the Jewish matrix. And then, of course, there's Jewish Christianity, which we read all about in Acts, in that there were those that would not break from the Jewish mold, and there would be the Jewish believers that would stay loyal to the law. And this is who they were competing with. They were contending with, trying to bring the message to, and who you'll be reading about in the next few weeks with Scott. Now, as I started, I pointed out that I hoped that this would actually spark further study. A lot of things that I said, I just brushed over. I hope that something may have sparked, I want to know more about that. And please, if you do, come ask me. I'll be happy to talk to you more about it. But there's a lot of information about the things that we talked about tonight. We live in a world that I described as moving away from God. We're going to be talking to people that aren't going to believe what we believe. And we're going to have to be able to see through their lens well enough to be able to approach them. Paul saw through the lens of the philosophers and spoke philosophy. He taught from a method, from whatever he needed to do, he was able to speak to the people he was speaking to. And he was an expert at that, whether it was through law, when he used legal abilities that he had learned, or whether it was through philosophy. We have the same situation today that they had then. I hope that's, if we don't get anything else out of tonight, that we can know that we're not lost in our quest to be light to this world, because that's what they were. They were light in a world that wanted to expel them. They wanted to not hear what they had to say, because they found what they had to say, the way they lived, the things that they did, found it repugnant. Popular religion was unable to hold the conviction of the educated during that time in paganism. Philosophy was unable to reach the masses, but Christianity was able to reach both. And we can do that again. And I appreciate you guys staying awake through this. I do. I appreciate Scott letting me do this tonight. And do take the effort to take a look at these upcoming nights that you're going to be learning about these churches, and consider the obstacles and the things that they were going through. Thank you.